On the morning of June 4th, 1942, four Japanese aircraft carriers turned the Central Pacific into the most contested piece of real estate on Earth, and within roughly 6 minutes, three of them were burning wrecks. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo commanded the most experienced carrier strike force in the world, the same First Air Fleet that had hit Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, and by 10:26 that morning his flagship Akagi was finished as a fighting ship. For 70 years, the standard explanation for those 6 minutes came from one man, a man who had every reason to shade the truth in his own favor, and that story turned out to be largely false. The real explanation is more damning for Japanese naval doctrine, not less. The myth says Japan lost because of 5 minutes of catastrophic bad luck. Japanese records that stayed out of Western hands for decades tell a different story, one where the real damage was done by decisions made weeks, days, and hours before those 5 minutes ever started. What follows is both versions, and an explanation of why one of them survived in the public imagination for 50 years after historians should have known better. 6 months before Midway, Nagumo's First Air Fleet, the Kido Butai, had launched the Pearl Harbor attack, and then spent the winter and spring of 1942 rampaging almost unopposed across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Wake Island fell, Rabaul fell, and Darwin took a heavy bombing raid, while British forces got pushed out of Ceylon in an attack that shook the Royal Navy's confidence across the entire Eastern Theater. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's combined fleet had not lost a single major engagement since the war began. That streak met its first real test in the first week of May 1942, when the Battle of Coral Sea was fought near Australia between American and Japanese carrier forces that never came within sight of each other's ships. America lost the fleet carrier Lexington, and Japan lost only the light carrier Shoho, which on paper reads like a tactical Japanese win. The damage that actually mattered for the coming battle never showed up on a casualty list. Yorktown took a bomb hit that would need weeks of repair, Shokaku took worse damage still, and Zuikaku, whose hull came through essentially untouched, lost so many aircrew in the fighting that the ship couldn't be recrewed with trained pilots in time for the next operation. Carrier Division 5, built around Shokaku and Zuikaku, was arguably the newest and most capable pair of fleet carriers in the entire Imperial Japanese Navy, and Coral Sea knocked it out of Yamamoto's order of battle before the Midway operation even began. Nagumo sailed north with 4 fleet carriers instead of 6, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. 2 of Japan's best ships, along with their veteran aircrews, sat in port at the exact moment Japan needed every carrier deck it could field. Calling this 2 fewer carriers undersells the gap by a wide margin. Bring Shokaku and Zuikaku along, and the Kido Butai shows up with 6 fleet carriers and well over 300 additional aircraft, roughly 50% more offensive striking power than Nagumo actually commanded, plus enough reserve aircraft that the armament crisis covered later in this account might never have happened at all. Coral Sea gets treated by some historians as a minor, indecisive prelude, yet it cost Japan a third of its carrier strength at Midway before the Midway operation had even started. One correction is worth making early, since it shows up in nearly every documentary about this period, and it simply isn't true. Admiral Yamamoto is widely quoted as saying, after Pearl Harbor, that he feared Japan had only awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. It's one of the most repeated lines in World War II documentary filmmaking, and no verified evidence shows Yamamoto ever said or wrote it. The line traces back to the 1970 film Tora, not to any wartime document, letter, or diary, and Yamamoto isn't even known to have kept a diary. Decades of searching by naval historians have never turned up a primary source for it. What Yamamoto did verifiably say is less quotable, but tells you more about the man. Before the war began, he told members of the Japanese cabinet he could run wild for 6 months, and that after that he had no expectation of ultimate success. Then, in a written reply to Ogata Take Tora dated January 9, 1942, weeks after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto wrote that a military man could scarcely take pride in having, in his own words, smitten a sleeping enemy. and he predicted an angered, outraged opponent would soon launch a determined counterattack. That's the Yamamoto quote worth remembering. Not a cinematic line about a sleeping giant, but a working admiral's private admission that Pearl Harbor had bought Japan time and nothing more, with the clock already running. On April 18, 1942, 16 American B-25 Mitchell bombers launched from the carrier USS Hornet on a mission Japanese naval planners had assumed was operationally impossible, and struck Tokyo and several other Japanese cities in a single afternoon. The material damage from the Doolittle raid stayed genuinely minor. What it did to morale inside Japan's naval high command was another matter entirely. Yamamoto had already presented his Midway plan to the Naval General Staff on April 2nd, over objections from officers who wanted to concentrate on the ongoing New Guinea campaign. And once American bombs had actually fallen on the home islands, that resistance evaporated almost overnight. The raid didn't create Yamamoto's plan. It silenced the men who might have stopped it. Yamamoto's strategic goal at Midway split into two parts meant to reinforce each other. Seizing the atoll itself would extend Japan's defensive perimeter and hand the Navy a forward base within striking distance of Hawaii, and using the invasion as bait would draw out and destroy the American carriers that had escaped Pearl Harbor back in December. Failing to sink the American flat tops in port meant sinking them in open water instead, at a time and place of Japan's own choosing. Yamamoto's own staff largely built the plan and pushed it through the Naval General Staff over real internal resistance, and Commander Minoru Jinda shaped how the carrier force would actually fight once battle was joined. Jinda and Fukuda belonged to the same generation of aggressive, offense-minded carrier aviators who had designed the Pearl Harbor strike, and that same doctrine, barely modified by whatever lessons Coral Sea might have taught, carried straight into a far more dangerous fight against an opponent who this time knew Japan was coming. Yamamoto's operational design mirrors a pattern that shows up constantly in venture-backed business strategy, overextension chasing a single knockout event. He committed the overwhelming majority of the combined fleet, spread across dozens of ships and several simultaneous operations, betting the health of the whole organization on one decisive blow instead of building something slower and more sustainable. It's the naval equivalent of spending an entire marketing budget on one launch event and assuming the product sells itself once the doors open. Yamamoto spread Japanese naval power across an enormous stretch of ocean on purpose, all in the name of deception. His main battleship force, built around his own flagship, the super battleship Yamato, trailed Nagumo's carriers by several hundred miles, and the logic looked clean enough on paper. If the Americans engaged Nagumo directly, Yamamoto's battleships could swing in from behind and finish the job. In practice, Nagumo's 4 carriers sailed into the most consequential carrier engagement in naval history without the extra anti-aircraft screen, the extra reconnaissance float planes, or the surface fleet backup that those trailing battleships and cruisers might otherwise have provided right when it mattered. A separate Japanese operation launched at the same time against the Aleutian Islands off Alaska, and popular retellings of Midway often call this a deliberate diversion built to pull American carriers away from the real target. Japanese planning records complicate that picture considerably, suggesting the Aleutian operation was pursued as a concurrent objective in its own right rather than a Yamamoto-designed decoy baked into the Midway plan from the start. Either interpretation leads to the same practical result. Assets that could have reinforced Nagumo went somewhere else entirely, hundreds of miles to the north. That Aleutian force also carried something Nagumo's carriers badly needed and didn't have, which was functioning radar. The prototype radar sets available to the Imperial Navy at this point in the war went to the ships supporting the Aleutian landings instead of the Kido Butai, preparing to fight the main American fleet. Whether or not the Aleutian operation was designed as a diversion, it ended up functioning like one anyway, pulling away resources that could have closed one of the most consequential capability gaps in the whole battle. One detail from before the war reads almost like a private prophecy in hindsight. Yamamoto told Japanese cabinet members, before hostilities with the United States even began, that he could run wild for roughly 6 months and had no expectation of ultimate success after that. Midway was fought almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, to the week, and whether that's coincidence or Yamamoto's own arithmetic quietly playing out on schedule is worth sitting with rather than resolving too neatly. The dispersal itself deserves closer scrutiny, since it's easy to state as a fact and harder to actually picture. Yamamoto's main battleship force, the Aleutian Task Force, the Midway Occupation Transport Group, and Nagumo's Carrier Strike Force all operated as distinct formations separated by hundreds of miles, converging on a single set of coordinates according to a timetable built on the assumption that the American fleet wouldn't appear until after Midway itself had already fallen. That assumption, more than any single tactical error made on June 4th, may be the deepest structural flaw in Yamamoto's entire plan. He built it to fight an enemy who didn't yet know Japan was coming, and Station HYPO made sure that enemy showed up 2 days early instead, fully informed, turning Yamamoto's elaborate, deception-dependent dispersal from an asset into a liability the moment surprise disappeared. While Yamamoto planned in what he believed was total secrecy, an American code-breaking unit at Pearl Harbor called Station HYPO, led by Commander Joseph Rockefort, had already cracked large portions of the Japanese Naval Operational Code, known as JN-25B. Rockefort's team determined Japan was planning a major operation against a target referred to in intercepted traffic only as AF, and Rockefort felt confident AF meant Midway Atoll, though not everyone above him in Washington agreed. To settle it, Station HYPO had the Midway garrison transmit a deliberately fake radio message reporting that its freshwater distillation plant had broken down and the base was running short of water. Within days, Japanese signal intercepts picked up by American listening posts reported that AF was short of water, and the ruse confirmed the target beyond doubt. Nimitz now knew where and roughly when the Japanese planned to strike, and positioned 2 American carrier task forces to spring an ambush of his own. One quiet advantage rarely gets mentioned in popular tellings of this battle, and that's fuel. Naval historian Jonathan Parshall, in a 2010 Naval War College Review article, noted that the U.S. Navy had carefully amassed 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil at Pearl Harbor before the battle, correctly reasoning it would be the lifeblood of any future Pacific operation. Japan's failure to destroy that fuel storage back in December 1941 mattered enormously here, giving Nimitz's ships and the repair yard racing to fix Yorktown the operational runway to actually execute the ambush that Station HYPO's intelligence had made possible. Task Force 16, built around Enterprise and Hornet, went to Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a cruiser officer with no prior carrier command experience, standing in for Vice Admiral William Halsey, who'd been sidelined by a debilitating skin condition. Task Force 17, built around Yorktown, went to Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who held overall tactical command once the 2 forces combined. Yorktown's presence at Midway at all counts as its own small miracle of wartime industry. After the damage it took at Coral Sea, initial repair estimates called for roughly 3 months in dry dock, and Pearl Harbor's yard workers delivered a functional carrier in 72 hours instead, sending Yorktown out on May 30th to the ambush point American planners codenamed Point Luck. Nimitz later described the whole victory in a specific way worth repeating directly. He called Midway essentially a victory of intelligence. That's not false modesty. The United States didn't outbuild Japan's carrier fleet at Midway. It outinformed it, using signals intelligence to put an outnumbered, less experienced force at exactly the right coordinates on exactly the right morning. Then let doctrine, timing, and a handful of individual decisions settle the rest. Commander Edwin Layton, Nimitz's chief intelligence officer, produced a pre-battle estimate of the Japanese fleet's position later described as off by only 5 degrees, 5 miles, and 5 minutes. That's a level of precision modern logistics and supply chain forecasting software, running on satellite feeds and real-time GPS data, still occasionally struggles to match using nothing but intercepted radio traffic, direction-finding gear, and human pattern recognition. Nagumo's first air fleet sortied from Hashirajima in the final days of May 1942, split into two carrier divisions. Carrier Division 1 held Akagi and Kaga, the two oldest and largest carriers in the fleet, both converted from other hull designs, Akagi from a battlecruiser and Kaga from a battleship, while Carrier Division 2 held Soryu and Hiryu, smaller, faster ships built as carriers from the keel up rather than converted afterward. Between them, the four carriers embarked 248 aircraft, Mitsubishi A6 M0 fighters, prized above every other carrier fighter in the world for their range and maneuverability. Aichi D-3A dive bombers, which Allied forces knew by the reporting name Val, and Nakajima B-5 and torpedo bombers, reported as Kate. Commander Minoru Genda served as Nagumo's air operations planner, the officer most responsible for how the strike aircraft would actually be used in combat, while Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had personally led the first wave against Pearl Harbor, sailed aboard Akagi recovering from an emergency appendectomy performed just before departure. Fukuda spent the entire battle watching from Akagi's bridge rather than flying a mission, a detail that matters enormously to how his later account of the battle got received. 20 warships escorted the four carriers, including the heavy cruisers Tone and Chikuma, each carrying floatplanes tasked with long-range reconnaissance ahead of the fleet. American carriers carried 233 aircraft between three ships, and Midway Atoll's own airfield added another 127 land-based aircraft, bringing total American air strength to roughly 360 aircraft, escorted by 25 warships. In dive bombers specifically, the weapon system that would ultimately decide the outcome, the two sides sat close to parity. This wasn't an overwhelming American force crushing a weaker opponent through sheer numbers. It came closer to an even fight, decided by intelligence, timing, and a small handful of individually consequential decisions made under pressure. That parity matters for how the battle should actually get remembered. Popular imagination often pictures Midway as a plucky, outnumbered American force overcoming a vastly superior Japanese armada, an underdog story in the tradition of a small nation punching above its weight. But the aircraft numbers don't support that picture at all. Counting Midway's own airfield alongside the carriers, the United States actually fielded more total aircraft than Japan committed to the operation. What America lacked wasn't numbers, it was experience. American carrier aircrews in June 1942 were, on average, considerably less battle-tested than Japanese aviators who had already flown against Pearl Harbor, Ceylon, and Coral Sea over the preceding 6 months. The real story of Midway isn't a smaller force beating a larger one. It's a less experienced force, armed with better intelligence, beating a more experienced force that had already lost its two best carriers to a battle fought 4 weeks earlier. At 0430 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Nagumo launched a strike of 108 aircraft against Midway Atoll itself. 36 dive bombers, 36 torpedo bombers loaded with land attack bombs instead of torpedoes, and 36 escorting Zeros. Alongside that strike, Nagumo sent up 7 scout planes to search the surrounding ocean for American ships, and one of those searchers, flying from the heavy cruiser Tone and known in Japanese records simply as Tone No. 4, launched roughly 30 minutes behind schedule. That 30-minute delay became one of the single most argued over details in the entire historiography of Midway, and the traditional explanation for what it cost the Japanese fleet turns out, once you examine the search geometry closely, to be almost exactly backward. We'll come back to that directly. American PBY Catalina patrol planes spotted the inbound Japanese strike well before it arrived, and Midway's defenders scrambled everything they had, including fighters badly outclassed by the Zero. By roughly 0700, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the Midway strike, radioed Nagumo that a second attack on the atoll's airfield and fuel facilities would be necessary, since the first strike had hit hard without knocking the base out. At almost the same moment, American land-based bombers flying from Midway, including Army B-26 Marauders and Navy TBF Avengers on their combat debut, launched near-suicidal low-altitude attacks directly against Nagumo's carriers. Most got shot down before reaching their targets, and not one scored a hit. But every single attack forced Nagumo's Zeros into the air on defensive combat air patrol duty and kept his flight decks tied up recovering and relaunching fighters instead of freely preparing an offensive strike. This pattern is worth naming directly, since it recurs all morning and gets easy to miss if you focus only on individual squadrons. Between roughly 0700 and 1020, the Japanese carriers absorbed an almost continuous run of American attacks, first from Midway's airfield, then carrier-based torpedo squadrons, then carrier-based dive bombers, with each wave forcing a fresh defensive response before the last one had even cleared. None of these attacks did serious damage on their own. What they did, collectively, was deny Nagumo's carriers the roughly 1 uninterrupted hour his own doctrine required to safely spot, arm, and launch a full deckload strike, and historians consider that attritional pressure more decisive, in the end, than any single attack, including the famous one at 1020. Tomonaga's 0700 message requesting a second strike on Midway put Nagumo in an almost impossible spot. His reserve aircraft, held in the hangars below the flight deck, carried torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, the correct loadout for attacking enemy warships in case American carriers showed up. Hitting Midway's airfield again meant a completely different loadout instead, general-purpose land bombs rather than torpedoes. At 0715, Nagumo ordered the changeover, and crews in the enclosed hangars began the slow, physically demanding process of stripping torpedoes off the reserve aircraft and loading general-purpose bombs in their place. This followed standard Imperial Navy doctrine rather than an improvised shortcut. Deckload strikes in Japanese carrier practice got assembled and fully armed inside the hangar first, only spotted on the open flight deck once the entire package was complete and ready to launch as one coordinated wave, unlike the piecemeal, on-deck arming American carriers sometimes used. Then, at 0740, tone number 4, flown by Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Amari, radioed back a sighting. What looked like 10 American surface ships. Nagumo may not have received the full report until closer to 0800, given typical communication delays of the period, and at 0820 tone number 4 sent a critical follow-up. One of those ships appeared to be an aircraft carrier. Nagumo now had to reverse his own order a second time within roughly an hour, halting the Midway rearming and ordering the general-purpose bombs swapped back out for torpedoes, the correct weapon against enemy warships. Nearly every historian who has studied the battle treats this as the single most consequential tactical decision of the morning, made twice, in opposite directions, in under 90 minutes, based on fragments of incomplete information arriving out of sequence. Swap the bombs for torpedoes undersells the labor involved considerably. Ground crews had to winch each bomb or torpedo down from its mount, move it through the hangar to storage, retrieve the correct alternate ordnance, hoist it back into position, and rearm the fusing and release mechanisms, all inside a crowded, poorly ventilated hangar deck stacked with fuel-laden aircraft, while the ship itself kept maneuvering to launch and recover combat air patrol fighters overhead. This wasn't a switch anyone could just flip. It played out closer to an hours-long industrial process interrupted twice in the middle by new orders. Nagumo's dilemma sits structurally close to a manufacturing line forced to retool for two entirely different product specifications within the same shift, with no way to know in advance which specification the next incoming order will actually require, and the correct answer only becoming clear after the retooling has already eaten most of the available labor hours. There's a genuine historiographical debate worth naming here rather than smoothing over. The traditional reading treats Nagumo as indecisive, a man who, in the words of several older accounts, took counsel of his fears at the worst possible moment. A more recent and more forgiving reading, reflected in current U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command Analysis, argues Nagumo acted aggressively and entirely within standard doctrine, constrained by real physical and procedural limitations rather than personal weakness. Turning his fleet toward the reported American ships, rather than opening the range and buying time, reflects the offensive mindset the entire Imperial Navy had been trained into since before the war began. Both readings agree on what Nagumo did. They disagree sharply on whether a different admiral, handed the same information and the same doctrine, would have done anything differently. There's a useful way to test that question, and it involves what Nagumo's own subordinates did later that same day with far less ambiguous information in hand. Once Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu knew for certain American carriers were present, he moved immediately and aggressively, launching a strike within roughly an hour of the morning's disaster. Nagumo, by contrast, spent the morning working from partial, delayed, occasionally contradictory scout reports arriving one fragment at a time over nearly 90 minutes. Both men served under identical doctrine. The information available to each of them, at the moment each had to decide, was not identical at all, and that asymmetry, more than any personal failing on Nagumo's part, may better explain why the same Navy produced one decision that looks indecisive in hindsight and one that looks decisive. Here's where the traditional telling of Midway and the modern revisionist reconstruction diverge sharply for the first time, and the divergence matters. The traditional narrative treats the 30-minute delay in Tone No. 4's launch as an unambiguous disaster, the single stroke of bad luck most directly responsible for delaying the discovery of the American carriers and dooming the Japanese fleet. Historians Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, in their 2005 book Shattered Sword, invert that reading almost entirely. Their reconstruction of the search geometry suggests that had Tone No. 4 launched precisely on schedule and flown its prescribed track exactly as ordered, it likely would have missed the American task forces altogether, passing well clear of Fletcher's and Spruance's ships before doubling back. The late launch, combined with what the records suggest was a shortened or slightly altered flight path, may actually have been one of the only genuine pieces of good fortune Nagumo received all day. Amari and his entire crew didn't survive the war, so their exact flight path can never be confirmed from their own testimony. But the mathematics of the search pattern, reconstructed carefully from surviving Japanese operational records, point toward an uncomfortable conclusion. The very delay that traditional histories blame for Japan's defeat may be the specific detail that gave Nagumo any warning of the American fleet at all. This detail illustrates something important about how military history gets simplified for popular consumption over time. A clean, satisfying story about one unlucky mechanical delay travels easier than a genuinely uncertain reconstruction involving search geometry, incomplete flight records, and dead witnesses, and the uncomfortable, more heavily caveat version happens to be the one closer to the truth. It's worth being honest about the limits of this correction, too, instead of swapping one overconfident story for another. Parshall and Tully's reconstruction of Tone No. 4's actual flight path is itself an inference built from indirect evidence, not a recovered flight log, and Amari's exact heading, altitude, and reasoning died with him and his crew. What can be stated with real confidence is narrower than either the traditional or revisionist framing prefers. The standard version, where the late launch was simply bad luck with no redeeming feature, doesn't survive contact with the search geometry involved. Whether the late launch was good luck, neutral, or just less catastrophic than assumed stays a genuinely open question, and honest treatment of the battle leaves it open rather than resolving it for the sake of a tidier narrative. Modern search and rescue planning offers a useful comparison here. A search asset covering the wrong grid square at exactly the right time produces no better outcome than one covering the right grid square at exactly the wrong time, and both look identical in hindsight. A miss, remembered the same way unless someone goes back and reconstructs the actual geometry. Tone No. 4's delay changed which grid square it covered during the critical window, and whether that change helped or hurt the Japanese fleet depends entirely on where the American task forces actually sat relative to the two possible flight paths, a detail ordinary battle narratives, built for pace and drama rather than precision, tend to compress into one sentence about bad luck before moving on. One structural disadvantage sat underneath every decision Nagumo made that morning, and it rarely gets its own mention in popular tellings. Not a single ship in the Kido Butai carried radar. Prototype radar sets that did exist in the Japanese fleet at the time had gone instead to the separate task force supporting the Aleutian operation, and fighter direction aboard Nagumo's carriers depended entirely on visual spotting, plus escorting ships firing their guns in the general direction of incoming raiders to help point returning fighters toward the threat, with radio communication between ship and aircraft that frequently failed. The practical consequence was that Japanese Zero fighters on combat air patrol spent the morning being repeatedly pulled down to low altitude, intercepting a nearly continuous run of American torpedo bomber attacks arriving from different directions at different times, with no centralized radar picture to help commanders anticipate the next wave or hold fighters back in reserve at altitude. When the American dive bombers finally arrived from high up, much of the Japanese combat air patrol sat, by chance of timing and geometry rather than any single fatal choice, in the wrong place to intercept them. It's worth being precise about what this detail explains and what it doesn't, since oversimplified versions of the CP pulled low argument set their own historiographical trap. Japanese Zeros technically had enough time between some American attacks to reclimb to higher altitude. The real vulnerability wasn't one single dramatic moment where the fighters got caught napping. It was roughly 2 hours of cumulative, multi-directional pressure from repeated American strikes, combined with a complete absence of radar to manage that pressure efficiently, that left the Kido Butai's aerial defenses stretched thin and reactive at exactly the moment it mattered most. While Nagumo wrestled with his armament dilemma, the American carriers launched their own strike, though coordination between the individual American squadrons that morning stayed genuinely poor. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown launched at different times, took different search headings, and several groups never located the Japanese fleet at all that morning, burning fuel over empty ocean before turning back. Torpedo Squadron 8, flying slow, already obsolete Douglas TBD Devastators from Hornet under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, found the Japanese carriers alone, with no fighter escort, at 0920. Waldron reportedly told his men before launching that if only one aircraft made it, he wanted that man to press home the attack and score a hit regardless of cost. All 15 of the squadron's aircraft attacked that morning, and all 15 went down. Of the 30 aircrew who flew with Torpedo Squadron 8 that day, only one survived, Ensign George Gay, who watched the rest of the battle unfold from a life raft, hidden under a floating seat cushion to avoid being strafed, close enough to the Japanese fleet to personally witness the American dive bombers arrive less than an hour later. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked at 0940 and took comparably heavy losses, and of 41 American Devastators launched that morning across 3 squadrons, only 6 made it back, with just 3 of those still flight-worthy afterward. The Devastator itself deserves its own note, since the aircraft's failure that morning wasn't simply a matter of pilot skill or Japanese fighter superiority. By June 1942, the TBD Devastator already counted as obsolete by carrier aviation standards, slow, lightly armed, and carrying a torpedo whose reliability under combat conditions was separately questioned throughout the early Pacific War. Sending these aircraft in on low-level, unescorted runs against a defended carrier task force with functioning fighter cover mounted, by any reasonable tactical standard, to close to a suicide mission before the squadrons ever left their own decks. That the squadrons went anyway, and that not a single American torpedo hit its target that morning despite the near-total sacrifice of 3 entire squadrons, makes the human cost of that morning's fighting hard to fold neatly into a story about tactical brilliance. The traditional telling often credits this sacrifice directly with dragging the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level and clearing the way for the dive bombers that followed. The revisionist reconstruction complicates even this familiar version, since some torpedo attacks happened nearly an hour before the fatal dive bomber strikes at 10:20, giving Japanese Zeros plenty of time to wreck them in between. The real effect of the morning's relentless, multi-directional American assault was cumulative pressure spread across almost 2 full hours, combined with the total absence of radar already covered, rather than one heroic sacrifice that opened one door at one precise moment. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber group that morning, launched with a rough estimate of the Japanese fleet's likely position based on earlier contact reports, and that estimate turned out wrong. By the time McCluskey's squadrons reached the expected coordinates, nothing sat there but open ocean. His aircraft were burning irreplaceable fuel with no target in sight, and turning back empty-handed would have meant that everything Torpedo Squadrons 8 and 6 had just sacrificed bought the American fleet absolutely nothing. Scanning the ocean below, McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arisher, racing across the water at high speed. The Arisher had fallen behind the main Japanese formation while dropping depth charges on the American submarine USS Nautilus, which had briefly attacked the Japanese fleet earlier that morning and was now sprinting at flank speed to rejoin its carriers. McCluskey reasoned, correctly, that a destroyer moving that fast in that specific direction was almost certainly heading back to rendezvous with the carrier force it had been screening, and he gave the order to follow the wake. The gamble worked completely. Naval historians frequently describe McCluskey's decision to follow the Arashi's wake as the single most important tactical judgment call of the entire Pacific War, and Nimitz himself later credited it directly, stating that McCluskey's decision decided the fate of the American Carrier Task Force and, by extension, the battle. McCluskey's own account of his reasoning deserves more detail than most retellings give it, because it undercuts the idea that this was a lucky guess. Standard American carrier doctrine trained pilots to treat any Japanese warship moving at flank speed, alone, heading away from the presumed direction of an ongoing search, as a strong sign the ship was returning to a fixed point, most plausibly its parent carrier force, and McCluskey applied exactly that doctrine under pressure, with dwindling fuel and no confirmed target, at the exact moment the decision mattered most. In later years, he always insisted it reflected training and logical deduction rather than blind luck. He landed back aboard Enterprise with less than 5 gallons of fuel remaining, his own aircraft riddled with dozens of bullet holes from the combat that followed. There's a footnote to the Nautilus story worth including here. The single torpedo the submarine managed to fire at the Japanese fleet that morning struck the carrier Kaga and failed to explode, and according to Navy accounts, the dud torpedo's buoyant after section later served, almost absurdly, as a flotation device for Japanese sailors swimming away from Kaga's burning wreck that same day. Before reaching the 6 minutes themselves, we need to talk directly about the version of this moment that most documentaries, most popular history books, and most YouTube channels have repeated for the last 70 years, and about exactly why the man who told that version first had strong personal reasons to shade it. In 1955, Mitsuo Fukuda, the same officer who had personally led the first wave of the Pearl Harbor attack, and who spent the Battle of Midway recovering from surgery on Akagi's bridge rather than flying a mission, published a book with Masatake Okumiya titled Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan. Fukuda described the moment the American dive bombers arrived in vivid, specific, almost cinematic terms. Japanese flight decks, loaded edge to edge with aircraft, armed, fueled, and standing just 5 minutes from launching a devastating counterstrike against the American fleet. He wrote that the tide of the entire war turned in that single 5-minute interval, an accident of timing so narrow it read like fate stepping directly into human affairs. The U.S. Naval Institute's own magazine, Proceedings, reprinted the account that same year under the title 5 Fateful Minutes at Midway, and it became the foundational source for nearly every popular history of the battle that followed, including Gordon Pring's miracle at Midway and Walter Lord's incredible victory, shaping the imagery of the 1976 feature film as well. For roughly half a century, The 5 fateful minutes simply was midway in the public imagination, an almost mythic explanation with genuine emotional pull. Japan came within 5 literal minutes of winning the entire Pacific War, and lost only because the clock, cruelly, ran out first. Fukuda's account carried unusual authority for a specific reason that shaped how it got received. He hadn't just witnessed Midway. He was the man who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, a genuine and undisputed historical figure with first-hand experience of Japanese carrier aviation at its absolute peak. When a man with that resume wrote a detailed, specific account of what happened on Akagi's flight deck, Western readers and historians in 1955 had very little reason to doubt him, and even less independent Japanese source material available to check his account against. Japan's own multi-volume official war history, the Senshi Sasho, wouldn't be completed until 1971, 16 years after Fukuda's book had already become the standard reference. For an entire generation, effectively only one version of this story circulated widely, and it happened to be the version told by a man with a personal and institutional stake in how it got remembered. There's just one problem with that version. Close examination of Japanese operational records that stayed largely unavailable to Western historians in 1955 shows it to be false, and not accidentally false. In 2005, historians Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully published Shattered Sword, the untold story of the Battle of Midway, drawing directly on the Senshi Sasho along with Imperial Navy operational records that Fukuda either lacked full access to in 1955 or chose not to use. Their reconstruction of each Japanese carrier's actual status at 1020 that morning looks nothing like Fukuda's account. Akagi, according to the Parshall and Tully timeline, had only just finished recovering its last combat air patrol fighter at 1010, a full 10 minutes before the American dive bombers arrived, and was busy launching additional fighters to reinforce the patrol rather than spotting a fully assembled offensive strike. Kaga had launched its own combat air patrol at 1000 and carried noticeably fewer aircraft on its flight deck than Akagi did. Soryu was mid-process spotting additional fighters of its own. The reserve strike aircraft, the ones actually armed with torpedoes and bombs, still sat in the enclosed hangars in various stages of preparation, not fueled and ready in neat rows on the flight deck the way Fukuda described. Imperial Navy doctrine required deckload strikes to be fully assembled and armed inside the hangar before getting spotted topside as a single complete unit, which meant the most dangerous cargo aboard any of these 4 ships, at the precise moment American bombs began falling, sat below decks rather than above it. Parshall and Tully's own detailed calculation, published in a 2001 Naval War College Review article co-authored with Bruce Dixon, put the earliest realistic launch time for a full Japanese counterstrike at 1050, with the entire strike not fully airborne until closer to 1100. That's not 5 minutes after the American attack arrived. It's roughly 30 to 45 minutes after it. A gap that transforms Fukuda's story of a war-deciding coincidence into something closer to an ordinary, if still catastrophic, tactical defeat rooted in doctrine rather than fate. The evidence behind this correction didn't arrive as a single smoking gun document. It emerged from several independent threads converging on the same conclusion. Aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by American B-17 bombers that morning showed largely empty Japanese flight decks across a roughly 35-minute window, a window during which Fukuda's account requires those same decks to be fully packed with aircraft. Survivor testimony from Richard Best, the American pilot who personally dove on Akagi, described only a handful of aircraft visible topside at the moment of attack. A captured Japanese airman from Soryu, interrogated by American intelligence officers after the battle, stated that only about 3 aircraft sat on his ship's flight deck at the time, and Japan's own official post-war history directly contradicts Fukuda's published version. This kind of reconstruction has more in common with how forensic accountants uncover a corporate fraud than with a single dramatic discovery. No individual receipt proves the case on its own, but dozens of small, independently sourced records, cross-checked against each other, eventually make only one version of events mathematically possible. Historian Jonathan Parshall has since publicly called the 5-minute story the most pernicious myth of the entire battle, arguing directly that it was intentionally fed into the historical record by Fukuda himself. Fukuda's credibility problem was never limited to Midway alone. Historians examining his separate claims about Pearl Harbor, including a story about a planned third wave specifically targeting the base's fuel storage tanks, have concluded those accounts were exaggerated or invented outright, and Commander Minoru Jinda, who would have been in a position to know, denied the entire fuel farm episode ever happened. There's a reasonably human explanation for why a career naval officer would invent a more flattering version of his own nation's defeat, one that sits underneath the historiography rather than on top of it. "We lost because we were 30 seconds too slow" tells a story about bad luck, one that assigns no blame to anyone, while "we lost because our own doctrine required us to keep our most dangerous ordnance sealed inside flammable, poorly ventilated hangars for the better part of an hour, while operating without radar against an enemy fleet we could barely locate," tells a story about institutional and doctrinal failure. Nobody who helped build and defend that institution across an entire career had much incentive to be the one who told it honestly. Whatever the precise readiness state of each individual carrier, the outcome between 10:20 and 10:26 that morning came total and nearly simultaneous. Dive bombers from Enterprise under McCluskey and from Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie arrived over the Japanese fleet within minutes of each other, a coincidence of timing even the revisionist account treats as remarkable, though explainable rather than miraculous. Doctrine called for McCluskey's 2 squadrons to split their targets between 2 carriers, but both squadrons initially dove on Kaga by mistake, until Richard Best noticed the overlap in real time, pulled his own aircraft up out of the dive with 2 wingmen following, and redirected onto Akagi instead, scoring what amounted to a single decisive bomb hit on the flagship along with a near-miss close enough to disable its rudder. If the Parshall and Tully reconstruction holds, the actual location of the armed reserve aircraft made the outcome measurably worse than a simple open-deck fire would have been. Because the reserve strike aircraft sat sealed inside enclosed hangar spaces, still in various stages of arming, the American bomb hits triggered a chain of secondary fuel-air explosions trapped inside those enclosed spaces rather than an open-deck fire crews might have contained, smothered, or jettisoned overboard. On Kaga specifically, researchers estimate roughly 80,000 pounds of bombs and torpedoes detonated inside the hangar in a cascading series of explosions, and Parshall and Tully's account of the aftermath is grim and specific. The wreckage lay strewn with the bodies and fragments of the ship's own armorers and mechanics, the very men who had been arming the aircraft when the bomb struck. That detail connects directly to the casualty numbers covered later in this account, and it's worth flagging the connection now rather than leaving it implicit. The men killed in these hangar explosions were disproportionately specialized ground crew rather than flight crew, since a pilot in the air survived Midway's dive bomber attacks at a far higher rate than a mechanic or armorer standing next to an armed aircraft inside a sealed, burning hangar. That single structural fact, more than any other, explains why the traditional story about Midway wiping out an irreplaceable generation of Japanese pilots turns out to be the wrong story entirely, and why the real story, about ground crews, reads as less cinematic but considerably more accurate. Japanese carrier design compounded this specific vulnerability. Unlike British carriers of the same period, Japanese fleet carriers stored aviation fuel in tanks built directly into the ship's own hull structure rather than in separated, shock-isolated cofferdams designed to absorb impact without cracking, leaving the fuel systems far more vulnerable to cracking and leaking under the stress of nearby explosions and flooding already enclosed hangar spaces with flammable vapor. Shokaku, built to the same general design philosophy, normally stowed roughly 150,000 gallons of aviation gasoline in exactly this kind of hull-integrated tankage. One naval history summary of the disaster puts the underlying design flaw bluntly. The fleet could throw a devastating punch, but it couldn't reliably absorb one in return. The Imperial Navy was aware enough of the problem to attempt a fix. Shokaku's vulnerable fuel tank voids got filled with concrete after Midway, a crude but not unreasonable engineering patch, and it wasn't enough. When the newer carrier Taiho, designed specifically to correct these fuel system flaws, took a single torpedo hit in 1944, an accumulation of fuel vapor still triggered a catastrophic internal explosion that sank her within hours. The lesson from Midway had been correctly identified. It just hadn't been solved, and the same structural weakness that doomed Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu in June 1942 was still killing Japanese carriers 2 years later. Of the 4 Japanese carriers committed to the operation, only Hiryu, under Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, escaped the morning's catastrophe entirely. Naval historians remember Yamaguchi as one of the most capable carrier officers in the entire Imperial Japanese Navy, a man who had reportedly urged an immediate, aggressive strike earlier in the battle, and that afternoon he proved exactly why his reputation was deserved, launching 2 separate offensive strikes against the American fleet within hours of personally watching 3 sister carriers burn to the waterline. Hiryu's first strike that afternoon, led by the same Joichi Tomonaga who had led the morning's attack against Midway Atoll, found and crippled Yorktown despite Tomonaga flying with a punctured fuel tank he already knew couldn't carry him home again, and Tomonaga was killed leading that attack. A second strike launched from Hiryu later the same afternoon hit Yorktown again, and the carrier was ultimately abandoned by her crew. What makes this second strike remarkable from an organizational standpoint is that Hiryu's crew, by this point in the day, launched aircraft while operating as the last surviving carrier of a 4-carrier task force that had ceased to exist as a coherent formation only hours earlier. No Kido Butai remained to coordinate with, no sister carriers to divide targets with, no larger formation providing cover. Hiryu's air crews flew both afternoon strikes essentially alone, against a target defended by American fighters that had already inflicted catastrophic losses on Japanese aircraft earlier that same day. Yorktown would be finished off 2 days later by a torpedo fired from the Japanese submarine I-168, the same attack that also sank the American destroyer Hammond, a ship so severely damaged it went under in less than 4 minutes. Hiryu's afternoon counterstrike is the detailed, most popular retellings of Midway compress into a single throwaway sentence, and it deserves considerably more weight than that. A carrier crew that had just watched 3 sister ships destroyed within roughly 6 minutes still managed to generate, arm, and launch 2 complete offensive strikes within the same calendar day, a tempo of operations modern logistics and operations analysts would recognize as an extraordinary feat of organizational recovery under catastrophic pressure, roughly equivalent to a company relaunching its flagship product line the same afternoon its primary factory burned to the ground. By approximately 1700 that evening, American dive bombers launched from Enterprise located and crippled Hiryu in turn, and all 4 Japanese fleet carriers committed to the Midway operation were now lost or fatally damaged within the span of a single day, a rate of capital ship loss with almost no precedent in modern naval history. As Hiryu burned that evening, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi gathered roughly 800 of his surviving crew on the flight deck, led 3 cheers for the Emperor, shared the ship's remaining biscuits and drinking water among his men, and gave his own cap to a staff officer to carry home to his family. He chose to remain aboard and go down with his ship alongside Hiryu's captain, Tomio Kaku. Historians still debate whether this act of traditional honor cost Japan one of its ablest and most aggressive carrier admirals at the exact moment the Navy could least afford to lose him, though defenders of the decision note that Captain Kaku had already made the same choice to stay, which in the framework of the time meant Yamaguchi's own honor was effectively satisfied by his captain's sacrifice alone. Aboard Soryu, Captain Ryusuke Yanagimoto commanded enough respect from his own crew that a Navy wrestling champion got personally sent to remove him from the bridge by force if necessary, and the sailor found his captain standing with sword drawn, singing the national anthem, unable to bring himself to lay a hand on him. There's a darker anecdote from the same day that rarely makes it into popular retellings. Several captured American aircrew, including Ensign Wesley Osmus, taken prisoner aboard the destroyer Ayrshire, along with 2 other downed American airmen, were interrogated and then killed, thrown overboard tied to weighted fuel cans rather than held as conventional prisoners of war. Had the responsible officers survived the war themselves, they would very likely have faced war crimes proceedings afterward. The human cost of the battle overall, drawn from Japan's own official war history and cross-referenced against current U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command records, runs to just over 3,000 Japanese dead, more than 700 of them specialized aircraft mechanics and technicians whose training the Imperial Navy couldn't quickly or easily replace. Individual ship totals vary slightly depending on which record gets consulted, and the variation itself tells you something rather than being a simple error to smooth over. Commander Amagai, one of Kaga's own surviving officers, gave an estimate of roughly 800 dead when American investigators interrogated him after the war through the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, while Parshall and Tully's later archival reconstruction, drawing on more complete Japanese muster records unavailable to those post-war interrogators, puts the figures slightly higher, at 811. Soryu's dead show up variously as 711 in Parshall and Tully's account, 713 in the ship movement records maintained by the historian's own research site, and 718 in Fukuda's original 1955 account. None of these figures differ from each other by much, but responsible treatment of the battle means reporting them as a range with clear sourcing rather than picking whichever single number sounds most dramatic and presenting it as settled fact. American losses totaled 307 dead, including well over 150 naval aviators, with roughly 40% of the American carrier aircraft that engaged that day ultimately shot down, ditched at sea, or written off as no longer airworthy. Here's the detail that quietly undercuts one of the oldest and most persistent myths about Midway, the one claiming Japan lost an entire irreplaceable generation of elite combat pilots in a single afternoon. Naval History and Heritage Command records list roughly 110 Japanese aircrew killed across the entire battle, 36 lost aboard the carriers themselves, and 74 lost in the air, with most of those airborne losses coming from Hiryu's afternoon strike specifically. That works out to just under 25% of the aircrew embarked across all 4 carriers, drawn from a wartime pool of roughly 2,000 carrier-qualified Japanese naval aviators, and most Japanese pilots that day were, in fact, rescued. What Japan actually lost irreplaceably at Midway wasn't primarily its pilots. It was the ships, the flight decks, and above all the specialized ground crews, the armorers, mechanics, and deck handlers whose training took years rather than months to replace, and whose absence would be felt in every major Japanese carrier operation for the remainder of the war. Historians remain genuinely split on how much weight Midway itself deserves as the single decisive turning point of the Pacific War, and that disagreement is worth stating plainly rather than smoothing over for a tidier ending. Naval historian John Keegan called Midway the most stunning and decisive blow in the entire history of naval warfare, while historian Craig Simons has ranked it alongside Salamis, Trafalgar, and Tsushima Strait as a battle both tactically decisive and strategically influential on the largest possible scale. A different school of thought, associated with historians such as H.P. Wilmot, argues this framing overstates the importance of a single battle. In this reading, American industrial capacity made the eventual outcome of the wider Pacific War close to inevitable regardless of any one engagement, and the true grinding down of Japan's naval air power happened later, across the extended attritional campaigns fought around Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, where veteran Japanese air crews and irreplaceable ground crews wore away far more gradually than the sudden shock of a single afternoon in June 1942. Parshall and Tully themselves leaned toward treating Midway as symbolically decisive within a longer decisive campaign, rather than as one isolated battle that single-handedly flipped the outcome of the entire war. Both readings can be true at the same time without actually contradicting each other. Midway ended Japan's ability to conduct unrestricted, large-scale offensive carrier operations in the space of a single afternoon, though whether the war's ultimate outcome strictly required that particular afternoon is a separate and considerably harder question, one serious. Well-informed historians still answer differently, depending on how they weigh industrial capacity against operational shock. Historians Richard Frank and Max Hastings, whose broader work on the Pacific War narrative gets frequently cited alongside Parshall and Tully's tactical reconstruction, generally situate Midway within this longer attritional frame rather than treating it as a single lightning bolt moment. Their emphasis falls on the months that followed at Guadalcanal, where both sides fed carriers, aircraft, and trained aircrews into a grinding campaign that did far more cumulative damage to Japan's naval air arm than any single afternoon could. Under that reading, Midway's real significance wasn't that it single-handedly won the war. It removed Japan's margin for further catastrophic losses right as a long attritional campaign was about to begin. A navy that went into Guadalcanal with 6 or 8 fleet carriers instead of 4 might have fought that campaign to a very different result. Midway is the reason Japan never got to find out. For 77 years, the 4 Japanese carriers lost at Midway sat undiscovered on the floor of the Pacific. In October 2019, the research vessel Petrel, funded by Vulcan Incorporated, located the wreck of Kaga at a depth of roughly 5,400 meters, the first Japanese fleet carrier ever physically found, and days later the same expedition identified Akagi nearby at roughly 5,490 meters. Though damage to their remote submersible during the earlier Kaga survey meant no visual footage of Akagi got captured that year, Soryu turned up that same year at a comparable depth. In September 2023, the Ocean Exploration Trust, working alongside NOAA aboard the research vessel Nautilus, conducted the first detailed remote vehicle visual surveys of both Akagi and Kaga, along with the wreck of USS Yorktown, streaming the dives live and treating each site explicitly as the war grave of both American and Japanese sailors who remain aboard. Hiryu, which drifted roughly 17 hours before finally sinking nearly 80 miles from where the other 3 carriers went down, has never been located. The search difficulty isn't simply a matter of funding or interest. Hiryu's wreck sits in water estimated at roughly 16,000 feet, deeper than the other 3 sites, and that 17-hour drift means her final position can only be estimated within a wide radius rather than pinpointed from the ship's last confirmed coordinates. Samuel Cox, the U.S. Navy's own chief historian, has repeatedly framed these expeditions not as trophy hunting, but as an obligation to document war graves properly for American and Japanese sailors alike, a framing that shaped how both the 2019 and 2023 expeditions were conducted and reported. The historiographical correction begun by Parshall and Tully has, by now, largely won the argument among serious naval historians. Shattered Sword gets treated as the definitive modern account of the battle, cited directly by the U.S. Navy's own official histories when discussing casualty figures and tactical timing, and it received the John Lyman Book Award for Best Book in U.S. Naval History the year it was published. Parshall followed it in 2010 with a dedicated Naval War College Review article titled Reflecting on Fukuda, or A Tale of Three Whoppers, systematically dismantling Fukuda's credibility across 3 separate claims. The Midway launch timing story covered in this account, a separate claim about a planned 3rd wave at Pearl Harbor targeting the base's fuel storage, and a disputed account Fukuda gave of witnessing the Japanese surrender aboard USS Missouri in 1945. Wilmot and Tomatsu's own scholarship on the Pearl Harbor claim dismissed it outright as, in their words, blatant and shameless self-advertisement. Even popular film treatments have adjusted accordingly, and the 2019 dramatized film version of Midway depicted Japanese flight decks as largely empty during the American attack, a direct visual correction of the packed, ready-for-launch imagery that dominated the earlier 1976 film. What remains genuinely unresolved isn't the tactical reconstruction itself, which by naval history standards is now about as settled as this kind of question never gets. What remains open is the larger question underneath it. Mitsuo Fukuda told a story that made Japan's defeat feel like a cruel accident of timing, a war lost by 5 minutes that could just as easily have gone the other way with slightly different luck. The evidence assembled since suggests Japan's defeat came instead from a doctrine that concentrated its most dangerous cargo inside sealed, poorly ventilated, flammable spaces, a search plan that very nearly missed the enemy fleet entirely, a command structure that had already dispersed its own reinforcements hundreds of miles away before the battle even began, and a fighter direction system with no radar to manage an hour of continuous, multidirectional attack. If that reconstruction holds, the real question this account leaves open isn't really whether Japan came close to winning at Midway. It's why one of the officers who was actually there, on Akagi's bridge, watching it happen, spent the rest of his life insisting that it had. The Kido Butai's 4 fleet carriers were not the only Japanese losses in the days following June 4th. As the shattered remnants of Nagomo's force withdrew, the American submarine USS Tambor got spotted in the darkness by 2 Japanese heavy cruisers, Mikoma and Mogami, operating together. Maneuvering to avoid the submarine threat, the 2 cruisers took damage in the confusion, and American carrier aircraft found them out in the open the following day. Mikoma went down. Mogami survived, badly damaged, along with 2 escorting destroyers, Arashio and Asashio, also damaged in the same engagement. The loss of Mikoma works as a useful coda to the entire battle because it shows American carrier air power didn't stop being dangerous the moment the 4 Japanese fleet carriers went down. Once the Kido Butai's own air cover disappeared, every other Japanese warship in the vicinity, cruisers, destroyers, transports, now operated without the umbrella that had protected the entire task force through 6 months of unbroken success. Mikoma's destruction on June 6th wasn't a footnote. It previewed what naval warfare in the Pacific would look like for the rest of the conflict once one side lost its carriers and the other side kept theirs. Picture, for a moment, Akagi's bridge on the morning of June 4th, 1942. Mitsuo Fukuda stood there recovering from surgery, watching a battle he couldn't fly in, at the exact moment his own Navy's doctrine, not fate, sealed the fate of 3 carriers around him. 13 years later, he sat down and wrote a version of that morning where the difference between victory and catastrophe came down to 5 minutes of pure chance, a far more comfortable story, one that removes blame from doctrine, from training, from the men who built the Imperial Navy's carrier force and decided how it would fight. It turns institutional failure into tragedy, and tragedy is always easier to live with than fault. 70 years of naval historians eventually corrected the record using flight logs, reconnaissance photographs, and a captured airman's offhand answer to an interrogator's question. The tactical facts are now about as settled as history gets. What's left unresolved is a smaller, harder question, and it's the one worth sitting with after everything else in this account. How many other 5-minute stories, in how many other wars, are still being told exactly the way the man who lived through them needed them to be told, rather than the way they actually happened?